All right, guys. Here we are, our last hurrah for this energy unit. We've talked about metabolism. We've talked about ATP. We've talked about enzymes, and we talked about photosynthesis. So, as the flow of energy goes, the sun gives the energy off to autotrophs, which take that energy in from sunlight and convert it using carbon dioxide and water into glucose. Then glucose is passed on to all living organisms, whether they be heterotrophs or autotrophs. In other words, autotrophs keep some of it for themselves, but some of it passes on to the heterotrophs. And the heterotrophs and autotrophs are both going to utilize that glucose, as we see here, the glucose, right? Pen. Okay, the glucose, C6H12O6, is going to be combined with oxygen if it is aerobic respiration we're talking about. And we're going to focus most of the time it's going to be aerobic respiration. And it's going to convert that back to the carbon dioxide and water that can be used again for photosynthesis, of course. But to get our main goal is ATP. That's our cellular energy. How do we form those ATPs? How do we get ADP to reattach that third phosphate onto it? And how many ATPs are we going to get from that one glucose molecule? Is it going to be a good payoff? Okay. So let's take a look at first the equation here. And we have glucose becoming oxidized. Remember, Leo says GR, or oil rig, becomes oxidized. That means Leo loses electrons, right? To become carbon dioxide, the glucose is going to lose those hydrogens. Remember, losing electrons is also losing protons, or a hydrogen ion, which is H plus, right? So it becomes oxidized, but the oxygen is going to gain those electrons or gain the hydrogen to become water. Okay. So when we did photosynthesis, it was the opposite reaction. Okay. All right. So that's the overview, but we still have the question of how many ATPs. Now, you all have had first year bio, and in first year bio, we looked at the general overall reaction for cellular respiration as in these steps here. Okay. And step number one was our glycolysis. But let me see, before we go on to all the steps, what is this picture of? Well, we're inside a cell. It's cellular respiration we're talking about. So we're inside a cell. And the first part is going to take place in the cytosol, or better known as the cytoplasm. The second part is going to take place in various regions in the mitochondria. Okay, so let's remember our mitochondria has, yes, that outer membrane, that just is called outer membrane. Then it has an inner membrane, the inner membrane. Okay, in between is the inner membrane space. That's a very important aspect there, the inner space. I'll just call it inner membrane space, though. Okay, and then way deep in the middle here, we call this the matrix, way inside here. Okay, and all these things and these little folds that come down, remember, they're called cristae. Cristae. That's there. Okay, so here's our mitochondria, and we know the parts of that. Here's our cytoplasm out here, and we're going to talk about the overview of cellular respiration. We said it happens in steps. Now, it's interesting because a lot of times if you say, how many steps are there to respiration? About maybe 7 times out of 100, or 7 times out of 10, somebody's going to say there's 3 steps to respiration. I have been forever since I've been teaching this saying there's 4 steps. And only now are people starting to come over to my side. But the steps they used to say were glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle, it's also called. And then finally, electron transport. We'll say why it's oxidative phosphorylation in a moment. And they always left out this little intermediate step, which nowadays it's given it kind of its due right here. They're calling it pyruvate oxidation. I used to call it the conversion of pyruvic acid, or the conversion of pyruvate. Okay, so I'm going to say, jump on this board that I've always been on, that respiration has 4 steps here. One is glycolysis. That is the first step here. And I hope this is focusing okay on this diagram here. Move this down a little bit, see if that can get it a little bit better. Okay, come on, focus, do that automatic focus thing. Good. Okay, so glycolysis is our first step, and we're going to go into the details of that. Our second step is going to be this pyruvate oxidation, or I call it conversion of pyruvate. You'll hear me say pyruvic acid a lot of times. Pyruvate, you'll see like there's all these eights, and now they're calling them, they used to call them ic acid, and now it's 888. Okay. Third step is the citric acid cycle. Okay. See, they still say citric acid. Now they call it citrate, but it can also be called Krebs cycle. So I'm going to write Krebs in real big letters here. Not real big letters, but Krebs, because that's the guy who discovered it. And then finally, the fourth step, which actually has 2 parts to it, but the fourth step is called oxidative phosphorylation. The 2 parts to it are electron transport and chemiosmosis. All right. So we're going to tackle this by saying we want to know how many ATPs we're going to get from these 4 steps. Okay. And kind of the details about these steps, details that you don't even want to go into and can even go into further. Okay, so we're going to start with glycolysis. But before we do that, let's just look at the ATPs. If you look at these 4 steps, notice the first step, you're going to get ATPs out. Third step, you're going to get ATPs. Fourth step, you're going to get ATPs. Okay, this is why they never counted this as a step. But it's a very important step because a lot of what is going to go into this last step come from these electron carriers, these NADs and FADs, okay? And NADs and FADs are also produced in pyruvate oxidation, okay, as we'll see later. They don't quite show them. They kind of show this going in. They should have like NADs and FADs coming out of that also to go into there, okay, because first step will produce NADs, second step will produce a couple NADs, third step will produce NADs and FADs. And then finally, those NADs and FADs will all go down to this last step and really churn out a lot of ATPs. So we're going to get ATPs all along the ways, but really our last and final step, this oxidative phosphorylation, that's the big producer of ATPs. That's where we're going to see the most. Now, let's go back to this Leo says GER thing. Okay, remember with like the main reaction of cellular respiration, we're talking about electrons moving. Okay, so how are these electrons going to move? It really is all about them. And so I have a little like schematic here. The flow of electrons. We're going to start with glucose. There's a lot of electrons like bound in the bonds between that C6H12O6. A lot of electrons are being shared in those bonds. Those electrons are going to be passed off to these things, these NADs and these FADs, okay? NADs and FADs are going to be like little electron carriers. They're going to transport them over to the electron transport chain. That's part of that oxidative phosphorylation. But during that electron transport chain, we're going to have this proton pumping going on. They call it a motive force. Motive meaning it's motile, it's moving, okay, something. These protons are going to be pumping and diffusing. There's going to be a little bit of active transport, a little bit of passive transport to get the formation of ATP from ADP. In other words, put that ADP and that third phosphate back together. So for the overall reaction, okay, we want to think of these 4 steps. The first step is going to take place outside in the cytoplasm. The others are all going to take place in different parts of the mitochondria. And we also want to think of the flow of electrons, all right? So let's get started, and I'm going to continue with this video. I wanted to stop in a moment, but I think I'm going to continue, and let's go into the first stage, and this is going to be the details of glycolysis. And look at this picture now. Probably like, doesn't look anything. And I'm every so often going to refer back and say, we're in this stage right here. Okay. Let me scooch this up a little bit here. Okay. Having definitely difficulties with the camera. All right. So we're going to go into detail about glycolysis. Now, I want to show you something really quick. You're going to be getting this worksheet that has glycolysis in details like you never want to study. Trust me, I wouldn't want to study all this. I know this, and I have studied it actually before, but I hate it all together. This is glycolysis, or this is glycolysis. Okay. Do I care that you know this, all of this, and all these intermediate like things? No. I want to focus on the basics. Okay. And what are the basics? The basics are right here in front of us. Okay. Glycolysis, and let's write this way at the top here. Glycolysis, okay, has what we call an energy investment phase and an energy payoff phase. Okay, an energy investment phase and an energy payoff. What does that mean? That means kind of like what life means. In other words, in life, you're going to have to pay a little to make a little, right? You're going to have to pay for college. Why do you pay so much for college? Because it's going to give you that degree. It's going to give you the experience to get a good job. Okay. So think of paying for college as like your payoff phase or your investment phase, but your payoff is when you get that good job. Okay. And that's how glycolysis is. In the first part of glycolysis, look at what we're doing. We're putting 2 ATPs. It's kind of like we're spending $2. Okay. Yeah. College is much more expensive than that. And it breaks down to ADP plus a phosphate. There's 2 of them. And we use that. I'm going to call this activation energy. Activation energy. And like we've always said before, you got to give a little to get something out. And remember, we're going to get a big payoff here. We're going to get a little payoff first here. But in the end, when we go through all those 4 stages, those 4 stages again, we're going to get a good payoff. Okay? So we have just activated. So we're down 2 ATPs. All right. It's okay. Because as soon as this all happens, and remember, you'll see that other sheet. You'll be getting a copy of that, the one with all the diagrams on it. Let's not look at that again for right now. There's all kinds of intermediates, but ultimately what happens, glucose gets a little bit of ATP and it breaks down to other components. But then look, it makes 4 ATPs. So we spent 2, we've already gotten 4 out. We're already up 2. It's like if I say, I'll give you $2 and you give me $4, I'm going to be making money. I'm sorry for you, you're going to be losing money. But in this case, this payoff, paid 2 ATPs, got 4 out. But we also got some of these NADHs. They're going to carry these electrons. See the electrons? Think of the electrons as like they're kind of like hitching a ride. And there's 2 of them, okay, for each NAD. So we have 2 NADs, 4 electrons, because 2 electrons in each NAD, and 2 hydrogens, so 4 hydrogens. And what do we ultimately get? Well, we get this molecule called pyruvate or pyruvic acid. We used to always say pyruvic acid, and we get a little water come out, okay? That is glycolysis right there, okay? Payoff, investment phase, payoff phase. We invested 2 ATPs, we got 4 ATPs out, and we also got these NADs carrying electrons. And you know where they're going to go. They're going to go over to that oxidative phosphorylation. And we also got these 2 pyruvates. Well, now these 2 pyruvates are going to take us to the next thing. So just to look at a net, we had glucose ultimately changed to 2 pyruvates and some water. We had 4 ATPs formed, but 2 were used. So we had a net total or a gain of 2 ATPs. We also had those NADs go through. 2 of them go through, carrying electrons on through. Okay, that is glycolysis. So I'm going to go back to the main reaction. And so ultimately in glycolysis, we had glucose changed to pyruvate. We had NADs, and I'm going to write a 2 above this. 2 NADs. 2 NADs. Kind of like went and they're heading over to oxidative phosphorylation. And how many ultimate ATPs did we make? Paid 2, got 4, so we ultimately had 2 ATPs. And that's our first step. We've made 2 ATPs, and now we're going to take those pyruvates and go into the next step. Okay?